Hi, everybody. Glad to have you. You have joined the Climate Adaptation for Forest-Dependent Wildlife webinar series. My name is Jim Siegel. I'm the Ecology Curriculum Manager at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and I'll be one of your hosts today. We're going to be hearing a presentation by Jim Vose on climate change impacts on forest ecosystems. But before we get started, there's just a few things that we're going to go over. Just make sure that your audio settings is the way that you'd like them. So you can see the instructions below. It gives you some different options in terms of the audio. Next slide, please. This webinar series, this is the first one today, is quite a launching. It's a product of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Forest Ecology Working Group, our science applications and migratory bird programs, and the National Conservation Training Center. And we are joined by the USDA Forest Service and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, NIACS, which is a co-sponsor of this webinar. The Forest Ecology Working Group contact is Jeff Horan, and you're going to be hearing from him momentarily. If you have any registration or technical issues, you can contact me. It's Jim_Siegel at fws.gov. And if you're interested in any continuing education credits, either through the Society of American Foresters or the Wildlife Society, contact me and I will give you instructions on how to obtain those SAF and TWS credits. Next slide, please. This is just a little disclaimer. This project is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily represent the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. This webinar is being recorded live, and an audio recording of it will be available later, and we'll give you some instructions on how to access that. We are going to be using the chat function to ask questions. So we're not going to be, you don't have to raise your hand, but we are going to be using the chat. The chat bar is located below. And please type your question in, select everyone and then submit. And we will try to answer your questions during the webinar. And there will also be an opportunity to have your questions answered through email after the webinar. And I'd like to introduce Jeff Horan, who's the head of the Forest Ecology Working Group, and he'll tell you a little bit about the entire series.
Hey, thanks a lot, Jim. And again, welcome to everyone that's joined us today. We're really glad to have you. Again, my name is Jeff Horan, and I'm a forest ecologist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in their refuges program here in the Northeast. And as Jim mentioned, I also am part of the Forest Ecology Working Group, which is developed this series and a few previous series like the Forest for the Birds webinar series. But this particular series is a 12-part series that tells a story about climate change and its impacts on forest ecosystems and also forest-dependent wildlife species. We will examine forest ecosystems, their composition, their structure, and their structure under a changing climate, and the influence on wildlife populations and carbon dynamics. We will also share some tools and management approaches to help facilitate forest and wildlife climate adaptation at both landscape and stand scales. And then we had some objectives for this series. You can see them up there, but I'll be quick here. First is just be able to communicate issues related to climate adaptation with peers and stakeholders. We want you to be able to describe some major climatic and ecological systems across the coterminous US and into Alaska. We also want to discuss how forest and wildlife habitat may change and adapt. We want to talk about utilizing analytic tools that may help you understand these changes. And we want to be able to apply various climate adaptation planning frameworks and tools to promote current systems and conditions. Next slide, please. And before I introduce Jim Vose, our speaker today, I wanted to just give you a quick precursor for next week and for next month. So our second webinar in this 12-part series is called Climate Change Impacts on Wildlife. And that's going to be speaker Olivia DeLee and, Ladie, and she's from USGS and the Midwest Climate Adaptation Climate Center. So now, finally, I get to introduce Jim. So Jim Vose is going to be talking today about climate change impacts on forest ecosystems. Jim is an adjunct professor and lecturer at North Carolina State University, and he's also a senior research ecologist, now retired and recently from the USDA Forest Service. Jim had his PhD in forest ecology from NC State, where he still likes to hang out. He has his MS in forest ecology from Northern Arizona University, and then his BS in forestry is from Southern Illinois. Jim has spent the first 25 years of his career at Coweta Hydrologic Lab. Many of you are familiar with Coweta. Basically studying and leading research on watershed ecosystem responses to disturbances and to forest management. His most recent research examines the interactions among climate change, changing forest conditions, and water resources at landscape scales. He has led numerous national assessments and synthesis investigating forest ecosystem responses to drought and to climate change, including serving as co-lead on the forest chapter of the 4th National Climate Assessment. So with that, thanks so much, Jim, for really kicking off our series, and take it away, please.
You bet. Thanks, Jeff. Let me go ahead and share my screen and get the first slide up. Bear with me here.
Hey, we saw it coming, Jim, and then it popped back out.
All right, let me. Okay, what's going on here? We had it working just fine.
It's okay, no worries. We have a backup running in the background, so we can always pop that up whenever you say. Try one more time. Go ahead.
Let me try one more time, and then we'll see if maybe I've got something that is.
Macs are awesome machines, but sometimes Zoom does not like them.
Well, let's go ahead and just, I guess, just go ahead and go with the backup at this point, seeing as I can't seem to get it to like it.
It could be up behind your screen. Try that one time. Amanda, do you have?
I don't have access to the PowerPoint slide, no.
Right. Do you have a version that you can pop up? If you don't, I can.
We can just use that version.
You have that on hand, Jeff.
Okay, I got mine, so I can. We'll see if I can share. So, Amanda, if you can give me the option to share, I'll go ahead and share my screen.
Absolutely.
Let me see. It looks like I have it.
Yes.
Okay. Let me know if it's coming through. Okay.
All right, I can see it. So it looks like it's working okay. And I'll just...
Let's try to get it rolling here so you can...
through you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, apologies. We had a little trouble, little struggle with this yesterday. It seemed like we had it worked out a little earlier, but we're fine. No worries with that. So my pleasure to speak with you today. My charge today is to give you kind of a high-level overview of climate change impacts on forest ecosystems. As Jeff said, the next set of webinars after this will go into much greater detail on various aspects of climate change on forests and dependent systems within forests. So I'm not going to go into great detail, but I am going to give you that kind of that high-level overview to prepare you for the more detailed talks that are on the way. This presentation is built off of the work done by myself and my co-author, Dave Peterson, and numerous co-authors and technical contributors from the National Climate Assessment, NCA4, that was published a couple of years ago. NCA5 is now well underway. And so that forms sort of the backbone of what I'm going to talk with you about today. And we've made a few updates along the way and have sort of continuously modified the presentation to reflect sort of the state of the knowledge or the state of the science in terms of climate change impacts on forest ecosystems. Dave Peterson and I typically give this talk together, but just for efficiency, I'm gonna go it alone today and give our talk. So what I want to do and what I hope for is that we come away after today's presentation with you understanding and me conveying you these three messages. First is that climate change effects are already evident in some forests. This is not something that's down the road, something we need to worry about in the next 10, 20, 50 years. Climate change is already affecting US forests and forests around the world. Climate is still changing and continuing to change. And we are on the cusp of additional and potentially even more severe effects in the future. And most of the more severe effects are facilitated or driven by an increased frequency of really extreme weather events like drought or heat waves or downpours, and the associated disturbances that those extreme weather events or chronic climate change provoke. So combination of both the direct effects of changing climate, changing weather, but also the disturbances that go along with them, insect outbreaks, wildfire, etc. I'll talk today about the fact that some climate change effects are slow and really hard to see with the naked eye and require repeated measurements, or when the effect is observed, it's may have been started 10, 15, 20 years ago. It may take decades for some of those slow effects to be realized. Other effects are rapid, observable now. And those are things like fire, insect outbreaks. And we'll talk about what we've seen so far with those here in a minute. Both changes, though, whether it's slow or whether it's fast, can cause undesirable changes in forest structure, forest function, and the ecosystem services that forests provide for us and the species that depend upon forests. The final thing that I hope to leave you with is more of an optimistic view, in that the science and the management practices are evolving, being tested, being applied to give a good indication that ecosystem services can be maintained in most locations by implementing risk assessments, so knowing where to do it, and climate smart management. And I'll end with the talk, and we'll revisit these messages, though, that the long-term goal is to ensure that forests are resilient to both the stresses that we're experiencing now, but also anticipate what future climate stresses may come along. So first, let's just take a quick view of what's happening from a climate change standpoint already. What are we observing? Well, the graph shows the present day temperature change relative to the first part of the 20th century. Red, and the darkest red, indicates the places where areas have gotten the warmest, with the variable about greater than 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can see that over most of the western United States, especially, and Alaska, that a considerable amount of warming has already occurred. There's some places where it's less significant, and maybe even a little bit of cooling in some of the central southern United States. But most of the warming is already occurring, and it's happening primarily in the western U.S. Most of that warming is occurring during the cold season and at night. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail or any detail really on model projections, just for sake of time, because of the different models and the different RCP scenarios. But most of the models suggest and are pretty consistent that warming will continue in the future. And the scenarios, worst case scenarios, are pretty bad. 8 to 10 degree increase Fahrenheit by the end of the 21st century. And in some cases, very extreme temperature changes, possible extreme events by the end of the century. So we're on this pattern of warming that's likely to get more severe. Annual precipitation is also been happening. Again, note the variability. It doesn't happen the same way across the continental United States, Alaska, and Hawaii, but for the most part, places have either gotten drier, in some cases substantially drier, especially the parts of the western United States and the southwestern United States. Some places have gotten a little bit wetter, especially during particular seasonal time periods like fall precipitation in the eastern United States. Okay, so some places drier, some places wetter. Larger individual events, more extreme precipitation occurring as well. Again, not going into great detail or really any detail on future scenarios, but just in words, the future suggests that there will be more precipitation in many areas, more of it in the wintertime or off seasons, but a continual drying in the Southwest overall and during the summer. So the drier areas of the western United States, especially the southwestern United States, are predicted to be drier, and more extreme precipitation variability in the rest of the United States. Okay, next slide. Mentioned in the previous slide about extremes, and the modeling of future scenarios suggests two things. One is that extreme temperatures are likely to be observed much more frequently in the future. This is a worst case scenario, the 8.5 RCP. By the mid 21st century, many areas are predicted to have a large increase in the number of days that are above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So these extreme temperatures, especially combined with dry periods, produce what's called the hot drought condition, which is especially stressful on forests and forest tree species. So extremes, in addition to an overall warming, more precipitation variability, extremes are predicted to be more likely as well. All right, next. All right. So let's talk about now how forests are and perhaps will respond to the currently observed changes in climate and predicted future climate regimes. Well, let's just first talk about the importance of forests in the United States. They occupy about 33% of the land area in the United States. And of course, forests are distributed across public land, private land, urban forests, rural environments. And so all different types of forests are experiencing climate change and may respond differently, and certainly may have different abilities to manage to increase resiliency in the face of climate change. One of the things for sure that forests have going for it in terms of being resilient to climate change is that by the very nature of the fact that trees are long-lived, perhaps hundreds of years old or more, is that they have an inherent ability to adapt and survive to changing climatic conditions. That's the way that they ensure that long-term persistence and longevity under climate variability, which is inevitable to happen over 100 or 200 year lifespan with or without climate change. Clearly, though, one of the concerns and observations is that adaptive capacity is not unlimited. In some cases, stress conditions or disturbances caused by stress conditions are exceeding that adaptive capacity of the nation's forests, and their structure, function, health, well-being is at risk. Next slide. So we like to sort of describe the interactions between climate change and various impacts on forest with this graph. We're talking about climate change in the context of temperature, precipitation, and extreme conditions. Those changes themselves can stress or influence forest health, structure, and function directly through environmental changes, or those changes stimulate or increase the likelihood, extent, and severity of disturbances like wildfire, insect outbreaks that then influence the structure, function, and health of forests. It has no boundaries. It affects, as I said, all forests, both on public, private, rural, and urban forests. Some of the changes are slow. Some of the changes are fast. Both of those have impacts on ecosystem services, things that we count on for being provided by U.S. forests: water quantity and quality, carbon sequestration, forest fiber, wood supply, recreation, wildlife habitat, the specific focus of this webinar series. Okay, so let's go ahead and work our way through this, this diagram and talk about some of these impacts and some of these changes. Okay, next slide. All right, I'm going to start first with rapid change. Well, one of the things that has certainly been observed in the 2000s and continuing more contemporary is large-scale mortality in U.S. forests. High temperatures alone, or high temperatures in combination with drought, or high temperatures in combination with drought and insect outbreaks have killed millions of trees in the United States over the past 15 or 20 years. In 2011, the long-term severe drought in Texas killed about 3 million trees. The drought caused beetle outbreaks and just heat stress killed 1 million trees in California in 2015. And these stresses continue. Next. One of the major players in the enhanced mortality in U.S. forests is the interaction between drought and mountain pine beetles. Mountain pine beetles have caused tree mortality across 50 million acres in the United States. The graph picture on the right shows the current distribution of mountain pine beetle, moving up into Canada, also moving up in elevation, but very, very large areas of especially the Western United States, central Western United States, is being impacted by mountain pine beetle. Next. The range is expanding with warming. So it's not just drought, but it's also warming. It is allowing beetles, mountain pine beetles, to move further and further north as a result of warmer temperatures, which facilitate pine beetle expansion. Mountain pine beetles are also moving up in elevation, okay? No longer temperature limited and unable to thrive in the cooler temperatures at the higher elevations. They're now moving up in elevations and affecting lodgepole pine, white bark pine, and other species. The southern pine beetle expansion is not, or I'm sorry, the mountain pine beetle expansion, or beetle expansion in general, is not limited to the west. Southern pine beetle, typically, as the name implies, a nemesis in the southern United States, especially in species like loblolly pine, has now been found in the northeastern United States, in the New Jersey pine barrens, again, facilitated by warmer temperatures, which has allowed it to expand in a northern direction. Another very obvious rapid change facilitated by climate change is fire. And since 2000, the amount of area burned by wildfire has been substantial and growing. Over 5 million acres every year for the last 15 years or so, some of the years with greater than 9 million acres. The graph, and especially the red line on the graph, shows the increase in area burned over time. Certainly a strong trend of almost a 5-fold increase over that 20-year time period. The other line that tracks it is federal expenditures on fire suppression, tracks it nearly perfectly. So costing a lot more money to try and suppress these fires as they grow in size and require additional resources to try and fight them. Okay, next. Fire risk and fire season length have increased due to higher temperatures and more frequent drought. Those big fires in Colorado in December, January or so of last and this year were very, very late in the typical fire season context, mainly due to just that longer fire season. These larger and more intense fires are occurring and increasing the risk to people, homes, infrastructures, and firefighters. We're in an era of mega fires, okay? And this graph right here is from a recent publication by Iglesias. And it essentially is a depiction of two things. One, it's the increase in the amount of, or the number of fires. Those are just the circles themselves. And an increase in the size of the fires. That's the size of the circles. So the left-hand side, A, is the time period between 1984 and 1999. And you can see certainly there are some large fires in the western United States, occasional large fire in the eastern United States and Florida or along the East Coast, but most of the large fires in the western United States. The time period 2005 to 2018, you see two things. One, a lot more fires, so a lot more circles, and a lot more really big fires. The orange and the red larger circles have occurred. So more fires in general, and a lot more big fires, especially in the west of the Mississippi, in the western United States. Okay, next slide. So it's likely that this fire risk is going to increase, and the likelihood or the risk of very large fires is going to increase as we continue to warm and as we continue to have extremes in terms of low, dry, droughty conditions, extreme events. This graph on the right shows the increase in weeks with risk of very large fires across the continental United States by 2050. And what this graph suggests is that in many areas of the United States, but still especially the western United States, that there will be this continuing risk of very large fires. You also see some new areas pop up as a result of projections and in climate change. And that's some areas in the lake states and along the coastline of the southeastern United States and a little bit along the central Appalachians, where there's some projections of increased risk of very large fires by mid-century. So the trend is likely to continue. It's not just a Western phenomena, as that previous graph showed. There is a likelihood of greater wildfire risk or wildfire occurrence in the Southeast as well by about mid-century. Projection of about an increase of lightning ignited wildfires by about 34%. The picture on the top is a fire in the Okefenokee Swamp in southern Georgia. And there's been some recent fires in swamps in northern Florida as well. The picture on the bottom right is a picture of a community which was significantly impacted. In fact, lives were lost in the Great Smoky Mountain region of North Carolina. This is the Gatlinburg fires of 2016 that burned quite substantially in that wildland urban interface. Okay, so there's certainly some observations that that increase in wildfire risk is not just going to be relegated to the Western United States, but places in the East could come under increasing risk as well. Next slide. Okay. The other change is drought. Declining mountain snowpack especially is reducing water availability and stream flow later in the growing season, causing summer droughts, lower summer stream flow. At the other extreme, high precipitation events are increasing the risks of winter flooding and causing washouts in many areas of the United States, as is shown in the picture on the right there, which not only has an impact on infrastructure, but also reduces water quality substantially. Yeah, slide. Okay. So those are the descriptions of rapid change. Let's talk a little bit about slow change. Again, slow change will have or can have undesirable impacts on forest structure and function and the ecosystem services they provide, but they are not the easy to see or the news-making changes that might happen as a result of climate change. And the effects of climate change on tree mortality and health can be obscured because, as I mentioned earlier, it may take multiple years for these long-lived trees to show the effects either through reduced health or slower growth or even mortality, so that these climate-related stresses on trees can go unrecognized for years. A tree may die 10 years after it was stressed, just due to the long-term persistence typical of tree species. Next slide. The other slow change, which is a little bit more difficult to observe or see, and that is changing suitable habitat for tree species. In some locations, the climate is changing so fast that it's outpacing the capacity of trees to adjust. That is, for certain genetic adaptations to reveal themselves as the environment that the trees are growing in changes. They're changing too fast to adjust. And as a result, that could potentially reduce forest health and over the long term, alter forest composition as those trees that are unable to migrate, unable to move to new suitable habitat become stressed and eventually succumb to unsuitable habitat. The graph on the right is a projection from a paper by Lou Iverson and others in 2008 that shows some projections of changing habitat from current to future conditions under climate change. And you can see that for various species, sometimes the habitat is improved or expanded and a better future habitat for some species. But in some cases, the habitat is changed substantially that the trees would have to migrate a considerable distance in order to reproduce, thrive, outcompete the other species as well. There have been some observations that altered forest composition is influencing stream flow and increasing drought vulnerability in some regions. In most cases, the observations is that stream flow is lower than it used to be as a result of higher water using species in some forests. And those higher water using species are also more vulnerable or can be more vulnerable to drought. So changing habitat, but also changing functional processes within current habitats as well. All right, next slide. Okay, so why don't we pause here, Jeff, and see if there's any questions that we can address at this point.
Hey, Jim, you certainly gave us lots to think about, and definitely people have been adding questions into the chat. So I'm just going to pull one or two quickly, give everyone a second or two to take a break and absorb some of the things we've discussed. But this question comes from Dawn Washington, who I happen to know is a biologist at our Canaan Valley Refuge in West Virginia. She's at about 4,000 feet. And so she's simply asking, do you think that we are getting back to the number of acres burned before we started suppressing fires? So suppressing, which really started 100 years ago or so, probably in the 30s. So do you think we're at that level, or historically, are we higher than that?
Yeah. Well, I think that at least the latest that I've read on it is that there's some suggestions that we're higher than that. And especially the size of the fires are perhaps much bigger than they were historically, because with more frequent burning, the landscape is more of a mosaic. Once it's burned once, it may take a little while for it to burn again, and so there's some natural inherent resistance to future wildfires in a more frequently burned landscape. And now, with long-term fire suppression, the fires are just much bigger. And as a result, on the whole, perhaps more acres are burned than were burned historically, and they're burned differently. They're much bigger fires, less of a mosaic.
Great. So there's some interesting questions in here. I'm gonna go to this one from Mark, and his question is, aren't there some effects of climate change that can be positive for some trees, i.e. increased growth due to increased carbon dioxide levels?
Yes, I think there is some anecdotal evidence, primarily from Europe, that suggests that there may be a CO2 fertilization effect. I don't think that is consistent or strongly observed everywhere. Part of the challenge with that being proven is it is hard to show experimentally, where you can control all factors and isolate any growth response to CO2. Certainly physiologically, trees grow better under CO2, but they also have to have nitrogen. They also have to have water. So in order to capitalize on that extra CO2, there has to be enough available soil nutrients. There has to be enough water for that to realize itself. But yeah, it's possible. And I think there are places where it's been observed where there is enough soil nutrients and there is enough water that there can be a positive growth response to CO2.
All right, I'm going to give you one more, and then we'll quickly get back to this. And some of these are getting personal, Jim. So here we go. This is from Mark Megalos, and so he says,
"Oh, Mark Megalos, yeah."
Yeah, sorry, Mark. And so, as a water and fish ecology guy, what worries you most in these changes, personally and professionally? What worries you most?
Yeah. Well, Mark did hit right on my my biggest worry, and it's water. It's water availability. It's worry about places where the ecosystem services that forests provide in terms of regulating water and providing clean water are at risk. You'll see that bias in a slide or two. But I'm really worried about water and keeping forests alive and healthy on the landscape to continue to provide drinking water and water for aquatic systems. Of course, fire risk is a big deal, but fire and water are highly related as well.
All right, back to stress complexes, and we can take some more questions at the very end. Thanks, folks, for your questions.
Yeah, thanks. Excellent questions. So the one thing I want to point out, and this makes it very complicated, is that while I discussed some examples of rapid changes and some examples of slow changes individually, and alluded to the fact that they don't happen individually, we are dealing with a situation that these things don't happen individually. They happen often in combination, usually antagonistic, where a drought, of course, makes fire risk greater, makes insect outbreak greater. Insect outbreak may increase fire risk, and then throw humans into the landscape. It's a very complicated interaction, combination of stresses that influence these disturbance regimes and compound the effects on ecosystem services. So it's complex and complicated. All right, next. All right, so let me sort of wrap up the next few slides. Just talk about adaptation, and by adaptation, what we mean is building resilience, and by building resilience, what we mean is increasing the ability of forests to recover from stress, whether that's an environmental stress or whether it's a environmental mediated or caused disturbance. Okay, that's what we mean by resilience, being able to recover from stress. The good news is that many of the current management practices that foresters implement are already climate smart and may only need fine tuning, perhaps doing more of it, prioritizing more at-risk forests to do the practices on, like prescribed burning, and may only need fine tuning. We're not talking about dramatic changes in the way the forests are managed to be climate smart. And the U.S. Forest Service, who our experience is primarily with, is already thinking about this, is already developing projects and implementing climate smart management practices into their current and future plans for on the ground projects. Next. So let's just give some examples of what we mean by building resilience with respect to wildfires. Well, with wildfires, it's really all about fuels treatments and using a combination of thinning and surface fuel reduction, prescribed fire, et cetera, to reduce the amount of fuels that are in the forest currently or will be projected to be in the forest in the future. These aren't a one and doneer because the fuels grow back. So these fuel treatment programs need to be implemented forever. And because of the substantial scale of work that needs to be done, it's really important to be strategic and use a risk-based approach to decide where to invest most of the time and effort into these thinning and surface fuel reduction treatments. The picture on the right just basically shows an example of a fairly heavy fuel load, about 300 trees per acre. And after thinning and some harvest, down to about 80 to 110 trees per acre. So you can visually see a reduction in fuel as a result of thinning this particular forest. Next slide, please. In terms of forest health, in response to stresses like increased temperature, drought, insect outbreaks, it again is about managing stem density, reducing the amount of trees on the landscape, hence reducing their water use, making more water available to the residual trees that are left in the forest. Also, just increasing the structural age class and genetic diversity of the forests that remain, providing that genetic, structural, functional buffer that allows it to be resilient. Not all trees impacted the same way, some more or less than others, but to be able to maintain that forest health and forest cover. Can also think about revisiting the historical seed zone guide, looking not at what it used to be, but what it's going to be, and thinking outside the box a little bit about the seed zones. In terms of building resilience for water and infrastructure, a lot of the hydrology is related to how the roads are built and making sure that the roads are suitable for future precipitation events, not historical precipitation events. Some of that is occurring now in terms of culvert inventories and upsizing culverts to match projected extreme stream flow events. There are some examples where the American beaver is being reintroduced in habitats they previously occupied. Part of the thinking there is to have some natural resiliency in the system to keep water in the forest, keep water in the riparian zones, to maintain soil moisture, etc. And there's also some good examples of using future projections of stream temperatures to set priorities for fish conservation. Okay, figuring out what streams are going to be at the greatest risk and where conservation practices need to be implemented. The Forest Service indeed has a transportation resiliency guidebook where it's looking at how to manage the road system, the culvert systems, et cetera, in the face of climate change. Next slide. All right. So I know that there's going to be a talk completely on carbon sequestration. So I'm just going to introduce it just a little bit here, and then you'll get the details in an upcoming webinar. But as you all know, forests play a real critical role in removing CO2 from the atmosphere. This is the mitigation side of the dealing with climate change. The most recent estimate is that the forest land offsets about 14% of the CO2 emissions in the United States. So about 14% of what we emit is being sequestered in forests. However, there is some projections that while forests will continue to sequester C, it'll be at a declining rate. And some of that is related to land use change and aging forests, which don't grow quite as fast and sequester it quite, they still store a lot, but don't sequester quite as much. But I think the bigger concern is that this increased frequency of disturbances, especially fire, but also insect outbreaks, will decrease the ability or decrease the function of these forests in terms of retaining carbon. So there is some worry about the offsetting effect of disturbances in this critical role that the forests play in removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Okay, next slide, please. So a little more about carbon sequestration and how in the face of some of the threats of declining sequestration capacity, is what are some things that we could do as managers. First and foremost is to retain forests on the landscape and keep them healthy. We've got to keep forests on the landscape. The ones that we have, we need to manage in ways that we talked about, fuels management, thinning, et cetera, to minimize extreme fire and insect mortality that kill the trees. Increase drought resilience, so we don't get the 300 million to 100 million trees dying on the landscape during severe droughts. Protect soils. Most of the carbon in forest is in the soil, 55% stored in the soils. Situations where there's significant soil erosion or loss of soils is a negative consequence for carbon sequestration. And probably most importantly, especially in the context of the private land matrix in the eastern United States, is valuing the ecosystem services, especially carbon sequestration, so forests aren't lost to other land uses. There's been a recent analysis by Grant Domke that suggests that we could also plant more trees and regenerate understock forests, and that we could increase carbon sequestration by about 20% by restocking. So what are some challenges and opportunities in the context of managing for resiliency? First and foremost, as I said, is keeping forests as forests. And that involves making sure that we regenerate forests after these large-scale disturbances, but also slow the pace of land use change. Keep forests as forests. Second is to manage for resilience and transitions, thinking about not necessarily sort of the historical range of variability or restoring forests to what they used to be, but thinking about managing forests so that they're resilient to future conditions, the future range of variability, and the transitions that are likely to occur as we move from current conditions to worsening climate change, perhaps. Managing forests for water supply. A very significant amount of the nation's drinking water is derived from forests. About 50% of the water that we drink originated from forests somewhere. And protecting and managing that forest to ensure that stable water supply, and that stable water supply in the face of changing forest structure and function is an important challenge, but also an important opportunity. And then the final thing is that I think there's quite a bit of evidence that we know what to do. We know some things that will work. The big challenge is how to increase the pace and scale of climate smart management. It needs to be done faster and at larger spatial scales. All right, so let's revisit the points that I wanted to make, and then we can ask some additional and answer some additional questions. All right, just real quickly, again, climate change is already evident for us. We're on the cusp of additional and potentially even more severe effects. The big challenge is having these long-lived species deal with very extreme events and associated disturbances that tip them past their adaptive capacity. Climate change effects some are slow, some are fast. Both can have undesirable changes. We're optimistic, however, that ecosystem services can be maintained in most locations by implementing risk assessments, so doing it in the right place and prioritizing the areas that were at higher risk, and implementing climate smart management, which is, again, not that different than a lot of the management practices that are already underway. And the long-term goal then is to ensure that the forests are resilient to both the current stressors that they are experiencing from climate change and associated disturbance, but also, and maybe even more importantly, future climate stressors. All right, that should be my last slide.
Great job. You covered a lot of ground, and there are also a lot of questions. You spurred a lot of discussion in the chat. So we surely will not get to all of them, but we can certainly get to quite a few. So there was some mention, Jim, in here about there were some questions about biocontrol, for instance, for some of the pine beetle species, and there was also discussion about someone mentioned that in New York State that southern pine beetle had moved all the way up into northern New York, and it's also in fact been found in Maine. That doesn't mean we have outbreaks that high, but along those same lines, a guy snuck in here think his name is David Peterson. I think he was a co-author of your, and so he made a comment here along those lines, and you can speak further if you want. But here it was his comment related to the biocontrol for mountain pine beetles. Managing for physiologically vigorous forest provides resistance to insects and pathogens. This includes ensuring that stand densities are appropriate for the amount of soil water available. Those densities may need to be lower than in the past due to higher temperature and more frequent droughts. Diversifying forest structure and stand ages will also help. And so that's where David's comment ends. But there was another comment below that relates to that before you answer this, and that it related to private timberlands where, do we need to have the same, do we need to have lower stocking? Do we have to reduce stocking standards on private timberlands? So they all are related. We're going from biocontrols. That's a lot to cover, but they're related. And I thought that was a way to get the number.
Well, I appreciate my colleague, Dave Peterson, sharing his perspectives. And I can't say it any better than that. And I think the private land question is a challenge that needs to be dealt with, especially in the eastern United States. Is that there are sort of traditional, well-tried, proven methods for growing trees fast or slow on private land, and I think that there needs to be perhaps some changing perspectives, especially with regards to keeping the trees alive and healthy on the landscape. In some cases, a lack of action may have very unintended and undesirable consequences. So I think this one solution is to evaluate alternatives of doing nothing, and what the likely risk is of doing nothing in terms of the investment on private lands, especially if it's a timber investment versus just holding on to it for wildlife habitat or whatever reason people have for us. I think the risks of not thinking a little bit differently, especially managing lower densities, perhaps thinking about genetic selections for more drought resilient species or breeding, is a survival. And literally a survival decision for being able to continue to manage forests and be able to continue to have forests for timber production. I think longleaf pine is a great example of a ecosystem type and a management option where those are very resilient forests. And I think there are some who are encouraging longleaf pine management in the southeastern United States for one of those reasons or some of those reasons is to ensure that they're going to be there for the next 100 years or 50 years or whatever that rotation rate is. So it seems to me like it's, nature takes care, right? So nature's either going to thin them out by insect outbreaks or drought, or it can be managed. That's my perspective.
Thanks for that. And so I see there are at least 52 new questions here. So we've got about 3 minutes, and maybe we can stay a few minutes extra. But at any rate, so we'll see how fast you can answer these, Jim. This is I've got David too. So here, he doesn't have a voice unless we give him one. But so this is from Lori. Should we be thinking about filling ecological niches, and she has in parens wildlife, to preserve ecosystem functions? And there were a number of similar questions here about rewilding and forced relocation and things like that of both wildlife and also moving tree and plant species up.
Yeah. Well,
slope.
My opinion is yes, we should be thinking about it. I do think it's an option, a tool that needs to be in the toolbox of thinking about assisted migration, I think is the word, right? I think there needs to be a tool in the toolbox and start to consider facilitating some of those transitions and creating at least refugia or options where we can keep some species alive and around and thriving for genetic diversity. I think there's some small scale examples of that. I don't know of any really large scale examples of that, but I do think it's something that seems to be gaining in thinking and perhaps acceptance. So that's my opinion.
So here's one from Dave Farringer. We will still have to accept intense and extensive fires in wilderness designated areas until they burn the first time again after our suppression legacy. Do you want to comment on that? Again, we have, you go to Yellowstone, for instance, and now there's no, it's a no touch.
Right. Well, I think there's some truth in that because again, the situation is daunting in that there's going to be areas that are going to continue to burn and burn intensely because of the high fuel loads and the inability to not just manage places like Yellowstone, but also even manage lands. I mean, there's just too much to do, and things need to be prioritized. But wildfires can have and do have some positive effects too. There are systems and species that are dependent on wildfires. The wildfire does provide some fuel management treatment. There's some discussion about wildfire management and what areas are let burn in some places, but that may have to happen in more places. And I actually think the Yellowstone example is a good one of a severe fire or intense fire and then recovery. I think it is likely that trajectory of more and larger fires is unlikely to bend substantially in the near future. Although I understand there's a lot of investment in fuels and wildfire management in the infrastructure bill. Exactly how much can get done and how effective that is unknown.
All right, well, let's try one more while we still have our audience here. And again, thanks to all for the great questions. And sometimes what we try to do is work with the speaker to answer some of these and send them out later. And we'll see if we can continue that practice when we have lots of questions. So I'm going to give Bill Copeland the last shot here. And so he's going to ask a little bit about proforestation, which is a pretty significant movement here in the East. And so his question is, for the moist forests of the East, how convincing is the evidence that interventions, quote, management, are superior to proforestation? In other words, just non-extraction, allowing healthy established forests to grow undisturbed. And then the question is for conferring resilience in the face of climate change, and then under what conditions. So that, again, that's a tough one, but it's one we're facing certainly here in Connecticut and Massachusetts. Yeah. They want to reduce the options out there. They want, like on state forests, they really want to completely eliminate the ability to manage those forests and just let them move toward old growth is the thought. So yeah. That's the movement.
Well, I mean, I'm not familiar with sort of the background of the proforestation idea that you talk about, and I think you'll have a speaker who will be, and that's Tony D'Amato. But I think one thing to think about is that the concept of that old growth forest is in the context of the historical climate regime that they developed under. And I would wonder if that structure, function, condition is sustainable under future environmental conditions. Now, it may be in the Northeast because it looks like it's going to stay pretty wet if the projections are correct, but certainly going to be climatic extremes. It's going to be hotter. It's going to be more dry periods. And to me, the context is less about sort of the old environment and the old forest, but is that untouched, unmanaged forest going to be sustainable and durable under future conditions? And it seems, and again, I don't know the answer to that, but to me, that's the trade-off. Is it the right kind of forest? Will it be the right kind of forest for the future? if sort of its current structure is what's desirable.
Yeah, we're cursed to live in interesting times. So, Jim, thanks so much. That was a great presentation. Again, you covered a ton of ground, and it was really a nice opening to talk about a lot of related stuff throughout the next year. So thank you so much, and thanks for everyone that joined us today. And I'll just remind folks, we'll be back together on May 17th for Olivia Ladie to talk more about the wildlife side of these things. So with that, thank you all, and again, thanks, Jim Vose, for a great presentation.
My pleasure. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Amanda and Jim, thanks for running the show here on the technical end.
Okay. Bye-bye.